All right, we're approaching the nitty-gritty time of doing the research. This is the part of the project where everyone will have to submit something. And if you have followed the rest of this lesson, you've probably seen ways to find good sources. I just want to review some bad sources that people have used in the past and just go over them. So let me first switch to this works cited from last year. If we look at this first link at history.com on Woodrow Wilson. First off, there should be just a couple URL suggestions for this student from last year. They should have the URL in it of itself. Um, be helpful. But here's the problem, right? If you look here, we don't know who wrote it. And so it's not a horrible source essentially because there is some editorial access here, but it it could be better. Like I said, it's not the best source. Um, this one, however, on the New York Times, you can see is a little bit better. We have an author, even though the person didn't cite this author, which is a problem. But if we just look and just go, we should get um, Ted Wimber uh, wrote the article. And the New York Times has an extensive editorial board. They're notorious for making corrections if they made a factual error. I'm not gonna get into uh, obviously the New York Times. You know, people write from a certain perspective, and that's fine. Just be aware of that. But for the most part, the New York Times does good research, especially when they publish a story, and that there's certain journalism uh, standards that they bear. So we'll go back to our works cited page. Uh, so that's an example of better source, but this history.com staff, that one's not that good. A lot of times students will also use things from biography.com, which is essentially the same network as A&A. It's the same source. You often find the articles between history and A&A are very similar, uh, and I would pretty much recommend that you shy away from them. So here's another one. I'm going to pull this up. This is another source that a student used last year on Thomas Jefferson. So I know there's a group doing Thomas Jefferson this year as well. And this is from ushistory.org. Even though it has a .org in it, it doesn't mean that the source is good in itself. We don't know who the author is, first off. Um, and that's a problem. The information in there is probably fairly accurate, but it's going to be really hard for you to uh, come up with research that supports something a president did and how that lends to itself to your leadership quality. So I would shy away from these. First off, we don't know who the author is. That's a huge issue. We don't have any way to check their credentials. Thirdly, this page essentially functions like a wiki page. Um, and so it could be a great place to start off, but it's not really a great place to finish. It's not very authoritative. Uh, I'm sure when I'm having, I'm sure we can go through here and find some historical errors that are vague or nondescript. So there's a couple issues, and like in this one, except Washington called on him 1782 again serve his country as minister plenipotentiary to negotiate peace with Great Britain. That actually did not fall to Jefferson. So even there, that's an issue right off the bat. So be careful with things like this. USHistory.org, history.com. Um, try and work on sources like this one, where someone you could identify the author. It's been an editorial process. That's the other issue with this page. There isn't, there's no way to know if this was edited, it was reviewed, if it was checked against someone who is an authority. We just don't know. So it's not to say that someone in there is wrong. It's more an issue of authority. I also had a student last year use a press briefing. Let's see if I can find it real quick. But they essentially, you have to, when you're looking at your sources, you have to remember who the audience is. Where did they come from? And You want people, if you're looking for research, you want people that are out there to provide an academic stance or some sort of academic integrity or academic um, intellectual contribution. That would be the best source. So that's why if you could find a source at the .edu if you're looking on the internet, or from a university press of some sort, you're better off. Um, when things come from the White House, for example, there might be a press briefing that's really designed for the press to get the facts out. But the White House, in that circumstance, if they release a press briefing, it could be a primary source, but they're sometimes trying to control the narrative of what they're doing. They're trying to tell people what to think sometimes, and every White House does this. This isn't unique to our current president, but you have to analyze the briefing. So here it is. Found it. So, so this student as well, they didn't even, um, fortunately at the time, they didn't give me a citation, but they were doing President Obama somehow allowed this, somehow convinced me to do that. Uh, but this was a press briefing. So Obama grants 153 commutations, 78 pardons to individuals deserving of a second chance, which the president has the power to do. This is some of his judicial powers. Um, say President Obama used that more than, and they cite more than many other presidents in the past. But at the time, this was a press briefing. It was designed to get their story out to the press and shape the news how they saw fit. And presidents do this all the time with media, and the government does this all the time with media, because otherwise the media will take their own spin on it, and commutations and pardons can be very controversial. Sometimes people feel that the president issues commutations or clemency or a pardon to people that really don't deserve it, and that they're breaching justice. Again, every president has their interpretation of this. Um, and that is totally up for debate, really, with each case. They can be extremely controversial, but this was a press briefing, and it was just designed to frame the narrative. So that's why it's probably not the best source as well, because of its intentionality. So keep that in mind when you're researching. Hopefully, it gives you an example of some bad sources.